Hi, my name is Tammy and you're watching Forever Altered. My topic today is grief changes you. I have mentioned on other videos that I lost my son at age 18, and it will be 10 years, February 22nd, that I have lived on this earth without him. I am not the person that I used to be. Grief changed me. It forever altered me. There is now a timeline in my head before his death and after, and everything is marked. Everything is categorized. Grief is more than just an emotional response. It isn't just a momentary response to something. It is a journey, truthfully. It is a journey. And no matter what anyone tells you, and no matter what books you read about the steps and, the steps of grief, and I read many books in the early days when my son passed away. I read about the different steps, and you put on yourself the expectation that that's supposed to be your path, and it isn't necessarily that way. I'm sure you've read them too. If you're here and you've lost a child, I'm sure, I don't know what the stage you're in, but I'm sure you've done your research, or you will do your research. And when you read that, don't assume that it's exactly the path you'll take, because the stages go forwards and backwards, and you make little baby steps forward and then you take several steps back, and it's not a smooth progression. Grief is thick. It feels like someone dumped syrup over your spirit. I used to say it's like walking around in cement shoes. The first 2 years, at least, I define as saying I was dead also. Literally, spiritually, emotionally dead, a zombie walking around in a physical body. It takes at least 2 years, if not more, before you even start to come out of the fog that you're in. Just walking around trying to act like everything's fine and trying to put on a smile, and when you have to go back to work and you have to have these responsibilities and so forth, and everything seems so trivial, so ridiculously trivial in comparison to what you have just been through and what you are still going through and what you can see as your forever future. It's really hard to fit back into life. Grief is paralyzing. It is exhausting. It is anxiety attacks when you least expect it, at the smallest trigger. It is a gripping fear. It is the worst. I remember waking up every single morning for so long, for several years. I woke up every single morning, and it's like for a moment, for just a split second, you would forget your reality. And then all of a sudden, this landslide of fear would come wash over you, and you would remember that your child had died. And you would lay there, and often I would have an anxiety attack, literally, before I even my feet touched the ground. Fear is a complete, utter helplessness. It is the realization that there is nothing you can do to change this. I remember I've mentioned before that my nephew died, and then my son died, and then my grandson died. And I remember when my nephew died, he was 16, and he died in a car accident also. He was a driver, and there were no passengers. And I remember being at the hospital, and my family being in shock. And at this point, I did not lose a child. I lost a nephew, and I watched my sister over his body, and she was stroking his hair, and she was kind of crying, but more whimpering. And I heard her say, "Mama can't fix this." And I remember my own fear, but I remember the feeling of helpless desperation, that there's nothing I could do to change this. And that is what she was feeling. You take care of your children, you meet their needs, you are there for them, and you fix things for them throughout their whole life. That's your job. That's one of the main functions of your job. And suddenly something has happened that you can't fix. And you can no longer meet their needs. There are no needs. They're gone. They don't have any needs anymore. Grief is hollow. It is missing a piece of you. It is a chunk of your soul left the planet and is now gone and will never return and restore on this planet. It's like someone put a big period at the end of the story. It's the last page of the book, and there's a big fat period there, and there's no sequel. It's done. It is like a door slamming shut on your future, on the future you expected to have, on their future, certainly. They now have no future on this earth. They left, and whatever didn't get done in their life is not going to be done. So all of the things you thought you were going to experience with your child are now they're not put on hold. They're gone. They're completely gone. My nephew never graduated. He never even got to graduate. So when my sister watched her other children graduate, it was very painful, because that was something that he never got to do. My son graduated, and he was in love and wanted to marry a very sweet girl, and he was a Marine, and so was she, and they had, planned this future. And my ex-husband and I were excited that we were going to have a new daughter-in-law at some point, and we were hoping for grandbabies and all those things. And that big fat period popped up, and there was nothing after that. You realize when your child dies that you no longer fit into your world, or maybe your world no longer fits you. I don't know which. The world you knew no longer exists. So it affects everything. It affects the people you come in contact with who don't know what to say to you anymore. It affects the smallest thing, a trip to the grocery store, when you see somebody look the other way and avoid you because they don't know what the hell to say to you. What on earth can I say to her? So you have to figure out how to acclimate to an entire new existence with a big part of you missing. Grief is a lifetime journey. It's a journey that never ends. It continues way beyond the funeral. In the first few days, in the first few hours when you're numb, in the first few days when you're going through all of the common processes of death in our culture. My son being a Marine, within hours of his death, I had tons of Marines at my door, taking charge of everything because they have a specific protocol about how things are done and about how uniforms are to be. And I didn't know how that was supposed to look. And they were wonderfully gracious. They even came to the funeral home with us to make sure that everything was coordinated properly. They had people standing guard at my son's, at the head of his casket the entire time he was there. They had the Patriot Guards came and shielded in case anyone tried to cause trouble, because there are people that don't like the military. And so there were all of these things protecting us, and there were people bringing food to the house and coming and trying to talk and tell us how sorry they were and that they were there if we needed anything. And you're numb, and the last thing you really want is food. You really don't want to eat. So I remember having container after container of food all around us. Actually went bad, most of it, because there was no way for us to eat it all. We had no we didn't feel like eating. But it continues way beyond the funeral. At some point, people go away and quietness sets in, and the reality of that big void that used to be your child sinks in. It continues to the point where you're deciding what to do with their belongings and what to do with their bedroom and the space they occupied, and trying to figure out how, in my case, trying to figure out how to get into my son's computer and his older phones. His phone he had was never recovered, but passwords, we didn't know his passwords, and so we were kind of locked out, and we spent a lot of time trying to get to whatever little morsels of him we could still have. So it just continues and continues. Grief doesn't ever go away. I can say that 10 years in, it changes, but it doesn't go away. And of course, the death upsets the natural order of life. You didn't expect this. You expected to, work hard and leave something to your children. And, at that point, my son was my only child. We adopted 3 girls after his death. But at that point, I went from having 1 child to having no children. So at that point, it was like I have no one to leave anything to. What's the point? What's the point of working and saving for retirement and accumulating anything? Because, like it says in the Bible, you can't take it with you. Everything here is just, it's going to stay behind. And that was very, very apparent to me in that situation. Grief is also terrifying. It's terrifying not just to you, but it's terrifying to others. It's terrifying to the people around you. They don't know what to say. And I mean, this is a topic all in and of itself, truly. And I want to do a video on this alone, because I remember the impact it had on me. And it actually was a big deciding factor of me literally abandoning my house and moving away to a new town where no one knew me, because in a small town, it's especially hard. You can't go anywhere without knowing everyone. And when you see, they don't realize that you see it, but you see that you're being avoided. People that would have normally went out of their way to come over an aisle and say, hey, how are you, are going the opposite direction. And because they're so uncomfortable and they don't know what to say to you. And so that was very, very traumatizing to me on top of everything else. I didn't know what I wanted, truthfully. In a way, it was a blessing, because I didn't have to pretend like I was okay. Like, oh, hi, how are you? I'm smiling and I'm happy. And, oh, I see you have all your children with you. Well, I don't know if you heard, but I don't have any anymore. So it kind of shielded me from that. But on the other hand, I felt like I felt like I had the plague. Like, I was always a very social person, and all of a sudden I had the plague. All of a sudden everybody was avoiding me. And I think it's partly because they don't know what to say to you, but I think they're also afraid that it's kind of like you have cooties, and it might flow off onto them. Like they might catch the, death of a child that you're bringing with you. Like they're afraid that, it's so horrifying to think that your child could die, and they have to stay away from it because they can't even fathom it, and they're so fearful that it could happen to them. But in all of the things that grief is, and all of the ways that it changes you, love doesn't stop. The love for your child doesn't stop. It continues. It still exists. Death doesn't end love, and it doesn't end the relationship with your child. It changes it. It changes it in many ways. It takes it from a physical presence where you have a physical body to love and to expend your time and your energy, your resources on. It changes that to an emotional bond and a spiritual bond. And it forces you to think about your priorities, your view on life. It forces you to consider your belief system, to reevaluate it maybe, or just to review it and grow stronger in it. And everybody has their own walk there, and that's one of those subjects that's I'm not afraid to address a touchy subject or to share my own beliefs, but at the same time I want to be respectful of everyone's. And I know that grief is a very individual process, and everybody has their own beliefs and their own way of surviving it and dealing with it. And for me, that also is a whole nother topic, because I raised my son in the church, and I was very confident where he was. He struggled a little bit after he got out of high school and when he was first going into the Marines, but he had some serious revelations and a renewed commitment to Christ. And I knew where he was, and my feelings haven't changed about my beliefs in heaven and my trust in the Bible, but I think it's a little bit sharper, a little bit more clarified, where before I was okay with sort of vague answers, there was a point where that wasn't good enough for me anymore. I didn't want to just think about, my son is, he's walking the streets of gold and that's it. I believe that your soul does continue on when your body dies. And I believe it tells us that. It does tell us that in the Bible. But no longer was it okay for me to not consider what our souls were doing there. And I believe we have jobs still. I believe we have, obviously they're not like this, but I believe we still have purpose in heaven. And we still have full lives to look forward to in heaven. So, like I said, I could make a whole nother video on that alone, but to continue on with this, there comes a point when grief feels like the only tie you have. The sadness that you're holding on to, that you sort of love on that. You sort of hang on to that because that means you'll never forget. And I don't know that ever really goes away. I think people get uncomfortable if you cry, like, oh, if I bring up his or her name, they might cry. And I've tried to tell people, if I cry, it's okay. I'm not expecting you to cry with me. If you do, fine. If you don't, that's fine too. But crying means I'm remembering. And even though I might look sad to you on the outside, there's also some joy there in remembering my child. And so grief is a part of you. Grief changes you. It is a part of you forever, I believe. I don't think you ever walk away from it. Tears are remembering. Grief is remembering. It's remembering not just the loss, it's remembering the person. You begin to have more smiles through the tears, and there comes a point when sometimes you can just say something, share a memory, because memories are all you have, and maybe no tears fall. But grief is still a part of the fabric of your existence from that point on, from that timeline, the before and the after. And it is a very difficult walk and a very slow walk, but it is a walk, and it is a process. And I guess I want to end with, I didn't mean for this to be this long, but I want to end with just a few things that evolve out of grief, that happen as a result of your grief journey, that maybe there comes a point when you can say, I would have never really come to terms and seen these things as multidimensional as they are had I not had this grief walk. And unfortunately, grief is a part of everybody's walk here. It's unfair that we're here talking about the grief because of a loss of a child. But you're going to face this at some point in other ways, the loss of a parent, the loss of a spouse. And there are a few things that you can cling to that developed clarity because of your grief. The first one is compassion and true empathy. Before the timeline, you can say things to people who are experiencing grief, and you can tell them how sorry you are, and you can try to empathize with them. But until you've been there, until you have been consumed with grief and understand the layers of it and understand the complexities of it, you can't really have true compassion and empathy for someone who is experiencing their grief. The second one is a changed perspective of life. Before the loss of your child, maybe you were more happy-go-lucky, maybe you were more isolated, naive. You have now experienced something that is so traumatic and so debilitating and so life-altering that your whole perspective on life changes. And you'll have good and bad times with that. Sometimes your perspective on life will suck. Sometimes it will be terrible, and it will be you will be angry, and that's okay. That's okay, because you're working through the process. But ultimately, you will have a perspective of life that is deeper and more meaningful than before. Another thing is appreciation. You will develop a greater appreciation for life in general, and for others, and for the more meaningful things here on this earth. Not necessarily material things. I'm saying You will have an appreciation for the smallest things. You know, you'll look out the window and you'll see a cardinal and be in awe of it, because you get to see the cardinal, because you're still here and you still get to enjoy that. And there comes a point when, you know, you have to begin to live for your child. Like, my child missed all these things, but I'm going to soak every bit of it up. I'm going to be a sponge and I'm going to soak every bit of it up. And then the last thing is self-reflection. You're going to have a lot of that. You're going to really reflect on everything in your life and your belief system. We talked about that a little bit, but you're going to have a much deeper and more grounded idea of your belief system and your morals and, you know, all of the things that make you who you are. You're going to work through all of that, and you're going to come up with, you know, where before you may have had some surface ideas of what that meant, but at this point you will evolve to feel very concrete about what you believe. Eventually. I don't know where you are on your walk with loss, but I wish I could tell you that it goes away, it ends, and, you know, you move on. But we know the truth. We know, yes, you do move on. Reluctantly, you move on. Fearfully, you move on. But there comes other joy in your life. I think of it as, you know, the being on an ocean and you walk in the footprint, and then the tide comes up and it washes it away and it fills it in with other things, with more sand. And I kind of think of that as my life. Although I will never get over the loss of my son. He was the love of my life. Don't want to cry. But there are so many other things on this earth to live for. So many other people here that need you. And they need you to be as whole as you can be. So let some good evolve out of your grief walk. And keep putting one foot in front of the other. One cement shoe in front of the other. Take care. I love you. Please subscribe to my channel so I can do more videos and maybe help others. Have a wonderful day.